Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're investigating a mind-bending discovery that, honestly, completely rewrites the rules of biology as we know them. We are taking a trip to a freezing, toxic world about 2.7 million light-years away in the Triangulum Galaxy. It's a place where the whole concept of squishy, soft, carbon-based life, that gets completely thrown out the window. Instead, what we find is a flourishing ecosystem where life is literally forged from solid metal. Today, we're focusing heavily on the staggering physiological differences between our kind of Earth life and the absolutely astonishing metallic structures of these alien organisms.
So, let's dive right into this incredible realization. That quote, that comes from Dr. Elias Thorne. He was a scientist aboard the intergalactic research vessel Hephaestus, and they were orbiting a super-Earth designated TR-774b, though the crew affectionately nicknamed it Tartarus. At first, their orbital mass spectrometers were picking up these localized cyclical concentrations of complex organometallic compounds, and, initially they just dismissed it as weird geology. But Thorne recognized that the thermodynamic disequilibrium was way too staggering. Basically, the chemical imbalance was so wild, something had to be actively maintaining it. That's when it hit him. They weren't looking at rocks. They were looking at biology.
First, we really have to establish why traditional, squishy, carbon and water biology is physically impossible on Tartarus. Just think about the contrast for a second. Here on Earth, our warm temperatures and abundant liquid water perfectly support lipids, soft cells, carbon chemistry, the whole shebang. But down on Tartarus, you've got a crushing 15 atmospheres of pressure. The oceans are made of liquid ammonia. The air is this suffocating soup of toxic reducing gases like carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. And crucially, the temperature hovers at a relentless, bone-chilling -60 degrees Celsius. In that kind of environment, water isn't a liquid at all. It's basically a rock-hard mineral.
And that extreme cold is exactly why our kind of life absolutely fails there. At -60 degrees, carbon covalent bonds become impossibly rigid. They just require way too much energy to break and form for any kind of dynamic metabolism. So nature had to adapt. Instead of carbon, life on Tartarus relies on the dynamic coordination chemistry of transition metals, specifically nickel. In this deep freeze, metallic bonds are incredibly stable, yet they're just flexible enough to be reversibly broken for metabolic processes. So, on Tartarus, carbon is really just the mortar. Transition metals, those are the structural bricks.
Which brilliantly illustrates the fundamental building block of Tartarus life. When the crew finally descended to the surface, they didn't find forests of wood and leaves. No, they found a sprawling, awe-inspiring fractal labyrinth of metallic scaffolding. Instead of soft biological cells, these organisms, which Thorne dubbed Nikkolytes, are constructed from hard geometric metal organic frameworks, or MOFs. Now on Earth, we synthesize MOFs in a lab, usually for gas storage, but on Tartarus, nature uses them as actual bone, tissue, and skin.
If you were to draw this out on a whiteboard, you wouldn't be drawing those spherical, pliable little cells we're so used to. You'd see a fractal labyrinth of metal. Nickel atoms sit perfectly at the center of every single node, and bridging them together are these rigid struts made of cyanide and carbonyl groups. The result? These tissues form incredibly strong locking cages of cubes and octahedrons. It gives the Nikkolytes this immense structural integrity, making them look almost like living bismuth crystals or walking Gothic cathedrals. It's wild.
But this immediately brings up a massive physiological mystery, right? If an organism's tissue is made of a hyper-strong interlocking metallic crystal, how in the world does it move? Think about it. A rigid crystal can't just stretch and flex like a human bicep. And yet, the research team literally watched these Nikkolyte creatures, which kind of resembled multi-legged, segmented chrome centipedes, dragging their heavy metallic forms across the landscape to hunt and feed. So how do they do it?
Well, it all comes down to the bizarre geometry of transition metals. When a Nikkolyte needs to contract a muscle, it uses ligand field theory to induce a chemical shift. By propagating a simple electrochemical signal, millions of nickel centers in the tissue simultaneously snap. They go from a 3D expanded octahedral shape straight into a flat, compact 2D square planar shape. This coordinated geometric collapse causes the entire metallic strand to physically shorten. It is, quite literally, an inorganic muscle contraction.
Of course, to power these rapid electrochemical contractions across millions of microscopic metal joints, you need a highly efficient delivery system. Now, Nikkolytes obviously don't have blood. The chemical interactions of our warm blood simply wouldn't work in that cold. Instead, their porous lattice-like bodies act as living circuitry.
They actually pump freezing liquid ammonia infused with dissolved sodium right through capillary tubes of translucent crystal. This fluid acts as a highly conductive liquid wire, instantly transmitting the electrical signals needed for those geometric muscle contractions.
Okay, let's shift gears to their metabolism and see how this builds into an ecosystem that literally exhales metal. Because, let's face it, if you're made of steel and crystal, a diet of simple sugars and glucose isn't going to cut it. You need raw, heavy materials, and you need a way to process them in the freezing dark. So they actually utilize a localized biological variation of what we called the MOND process. Massive fractal trees on the surface ingest toxic carbon monoxide from that heavy atmosphere, and they bind that gas to raw nickel iron ores found in the crust. This synthesizes a highly volatile fluid called nickel tetracarbonyl, which is basically their biological energy source. The motile creatures then drink this fluid, thermally decompose it to deposit pure solid nickel directly into their bodies for physical growth, and then they just exhale the leftover carbon monoxide back into the toxic sky.
But there's a catch to the MON process. It requires activation energy, usually in the form of heat, to drive those chemical reactions. In an ecosystem permanently locked at -60 degrees, thermal energy is the absolute most precious resource on the planet. Heat is the ultimate biological catalyst there. So when the human landing craft, the Acheron, touched down, its nuclear generators radiated a 30-degree thermal bloom into the environment. To the Nikkolytes, that was an irresistible all-you-can-eat feast of activation energy.
Driven by that sudden heat, a swarm of silvery, insect-like Nikkolytes descended right onto the human ship. Now, the military-grade titanium, tungsten, and nickel hull was completely impervious to the weather, but not to biology. The creatures use these complex mandibles to inject highly concentrated carbonyl catalyst enzymes directly into the metal. At a microscopic level, they were ripping the structural iron and nickel atoms right out of the ship's advanced alloys, converting them into liquid metal carbonyls and literally drinking the ship alive.
The human crew was sitting there moments away from a catastrophic hull breach, and they couldn't just fire their plasma engines because the exhaust would have triggered a massive thermobaric explosion in that volatile atmosphere. So what did they do? They vented their liquid nitrogen reserves directly over the hull. By flash freezing the exterior to -196 degrees Celsius, they instantly dropped the local temperature far below the biological activation energy required for the organism's dative bonds to function. The creatures didn't die, but all their kinetic energy just vanished. They were locked and frozen perfectly in place, which finally allowed the ship to escape.
Okay, before we wrap up today's explainer, we have to solve one final, absolutely mind-bending piece of this physiological puzzle: reproduction. We've already established that carbon is useless here, which means traditional DNA with its carbon backbone simply cannot exist. So without DNA, how do these complex metallic creatures evolve, adapt, and pass on the incredibly specific blueprints needed to build their magnificent geometric structures?
Well, when we compare the genetic architectures, we see a complete paradigm shift. Information, at the end of the day, is just data stored in a sequence. Earth life uses an organic carbon phosphate chain. Tartarus biology, however, utilizes what Dr. Thorne called metallogenetics. Deep inside their structures, instead of DNA, they harbor a long, linear metallic wire made of nickel and platinum atoms linked together. It's essentially a one-dimensional coordination polymer acting as a hard drive.
So, instead of the A, C, T, and G nucleobases that we're used to, these creatures use stereochemical data storage. The metallic backbones are linked by pyrazine molecules, and attached to the sides of that wire are auxiliary ligands. Sometimes it's a chloride ion, sometimes an ammonia molecule, or maybe a nitrosyl group. That incredibly complex, specific sequence of chemical ligands acts as their genetic alphabet. It encodes the exact instructions the organism needs to build its enzymes and to structure its magnificent geometric MOF body.
Honestly, this staggering realization proves that life isn't just some fragile accident that requires a warm puddle of water and soft carbon chains. If life is an inevitability forged from steel and poison in the freezing dark of Tartarus, it leaves us with a massive question. What other impossible, bizarre, physiological architectures are flourishing right now, quietly waking up and reaching toward the stars from the dark, extreme corners of the universe?
Please like and subscribe.